Hello, this is Heather Meeker, and this is a presentation on how to proofread a contract and other skills you wish you didn't need. This presentation is a little bit of a deviation from my usual subject, which is open source software licensing, but I've been working as a lawyer for a long time, and I've seen a lot of young lawyers try to learn how to proofread contracts. This presentation is offered in the hope that it will make the job easier for them. So let's get going. When you went to law school, you probably thought about arguing in court and negotiating big deals and all sorts of really interesting stuff. What you might not have anticipated is that you would spend a lot of the first years that you're in law practice doing things like proofreading and putting documents together. And if you're like me, you might not think you're particularly good at things like proofreading. I certainly wasn't, but over the years I've learned to do it. It's not an innate skill, it's something you can learn. And you might wonder, why do lawyers care so much about getting everything letter perfect? Because a lot of small mistakes don't matter very much. But it's more about the face that you present to the world. When your work product is letter perfect, it leaves a better impression on clients and supervisors and opposing counsel. Also, consider when you get a spam email. What is one of the signs that it's not legitimate? It's that it contains poor grammar or typos or it's unprofessional looking. By the way, those spam emails are directed at people who can't tell the difference. And that's part of the point. Not everybody can tell the difference between something that is letter perfect and something that isn't. So by putting your best foot forward and making your work product letter perfect, you're showing that you are one of the people who knows the difference. And finally, as you proofread to get rid of small problems, you're often going to find that you think of other substantive improvements to make to documents. So it's really just part of the process of finalizing your documents in the best form that they can be. So here's my philosophy about drafting and proofreading. Everything is about clarity and brevity and, of course, accuracy. And you will do yourself a favor if you develop habits early in your career that help you avoid problems later on. Just consider that a lot of the proofreading you're going to be doing is in the middle of the night or under pressure, and the more you develop habits, the better able you will be to perform when you're under pressure. One more thing. Different lawyers have different philosophies about some of the things I'm going to talk about. So when you're working for a supervisor, always follow your supervisor's preferences. But if you're working for yourself, you should follow your own preferences. And I'm going to suggest to you in this presentation that some practices are going to make your life a lot easier and make your work less prone to mistakes. I want to help you begin to develop those habits right now. Now, we all know that modern word processors have spell checkers and even grammar checkers, and you can rely on those tools to help you. But you cannot rely on those tools exclusively, because while there are kinds of typos that can be caught by these tools, there are also a lot of typos that wouldn't be caught by those tools. Maybe those tools will catch up someday, but they haven't yet. So you always need to do in-person proofreading of your documents. But you should use all the tools that are available to you. Just make sure that you're exercising the human judgment required to make everything as good as it can be. Now, here are a few suggestions to help you proofread properly. The first might surprise you a little bit. It's to use a ruler. Now, that might sound strange, but when you read with a ruler line by line, it slows you down. And here's why that's important. If you're the kind of person who got through law school, you can read very quickly. And part of what you're doing is not reading every word or every letter. You're skimming through the text that you're reading. So in order to proofread properly, you have to slow yourself down. Did you know that people who have reading problems often read with rulers? And it's for the same reason, to slow down so that you can look at every word very carefully and your mind doesn't get ahead of what your eyes are reading. My next tip is about environment. So personally, when I have to read a contract carefully to proofread it, I actually go to a different place. I don't do it at my normal desk. I go to a place that's quiet, doesn't have a lot of distractions, and doesn't have a lot of things around the desk. I might do this in the firm law library or the firm break room, or just some change of scenery so that I can focus entirely on what I'm reading. And you should use whatever works for you. Some people like to turn on music and put their headphones in. Other people like different environments, but make sure that you're using the environment that allows you to concentrate fully and best. And then the last picture on this slide shows two people, young people, reading to each other. And actually, this is a very effective way of proofreading. When I clerked in the Court of Appeal, this is the way we proofread opinions. We would have one person read to the other. When that happens, the person who is reading will tend to correct mistakes as they read. The person who is reading out loud. The person who is reading on the page will see the difference between what the person reading out loud says and what's on the page. And that's a really great way to proofread. By the way, another tip, one thing that some people do is have a computer with voice generation read the document to them while they read along on the page. This reading one to another method is actually quite effective for proofreading as well. It's just a little bit more time consuming and resource consuming. Now, this is a presentation about proofreading contracts, and contracts are different from other kinds of documents or normal prose. There are a lot of things that are in contracts that make them harder to proofread than normal text. And I'm not going to attempt to teach you all of the rules here. I'm going to show you some of the rules, and as you begin to write contracts and review them, you will get to know what all the rules are. But here are just some examples so you have an idea what I'm talking about. For instance, the party names, which are usually at the beginning of the document, have to be correct. They have to be punctuated correctly, capitalized correctly, and so forth. And you'll see in red, I say, get your client's name right. There is nothing more embarrassing than sending out a contract with your client's name on it spelled wrongly. Next, all defined terms, they're usually capitalized in contracts, must be defined. In other words, if you use a word in a special way, you usually indicate that by capitalizing it, even if it's in the middle of a sentence or not a proper noun. And the definitions for those terms will usually be in a definitions section of the document. So you have to make sure that all terms that are used as terms of art or defined terms are actually defined somewhere. And conversely, if you define a term, it should be used in the document. Now, of course, failing to include a definition for a defined term is a worse mistake than including a defined term that isn't used anywhere. But even the second one is pretty confusing to readers because they will be expecting to see that term somewhere in the document. Next, most contracts have numbered paragraphs, and it's important that the numbering be consistent and that each paragraph have a unique number. This is important because when you're negotiating contracts, one of the things you do is say, I'd like you to look at section 4.3a or whatever reference that you have in mind, and the person needs to be able to find that quickly, hopefully without flipping too many pages, and it should be obvious where that is in the document. There shouldn't be two paragraphs with the same number, and the numbers should be in sequence. Similarly, contracts often make cross-references to different parts of the contract, and so the cross-references all have to be correct. Here's a tip. There are ways to do section references automatically in word processors like Microsoft Word, but one of the things you have to watch out for is that if you move paragraphs around or you delete paragraphs, those references can become incorrect. And so while it can be very helpful to use automatic referencing, it also can result in problems. And one of the most embarrassing things is when you send out a contract and it says something such as do this as referred to in section, and then there's something that says reference not found. That means you've made a mistake and the reference has not resolved within the document. So try to avoid that. And just like the party names should be correct at the beginning of the document, they need to be correct at the end too. Most contracts have signature blocks at the end, and the names have to be correct, including the name of the company, and if you're filling them in, the names of the persons who are signing on behalf of the company. And finally, all formatting needs to be consistent. And there is a lot of formatting in contract documents. There are headings, there are titles, there are all different paragraphs, and all of them need to be consistent. So if you're underlining, say, a paragraph heading, they all need to be underlined. If you're bolding them instead, they all need to be bold. You shouldn't be mixing or matching them with no reason. Also, make sure that your justification of paragraphs is all consistent, whether it is full, justified, or ragged, that the margins are consistent, indenting is consistent, and so forth. And as you become more familiar with proofreading and drafting documents like this, you'll see that there are quite a few things to check. And here is something that I recommend highly. When you're proofreading, don't proofread on the computer screen. Print the document out and proofread it on paper. One of the reasons that I suggest that is that it is a lot easier to catch these formatting errors on a page than it is on the screen. When you're looking at a piece of paper, you will much more naturally see any problems with the paragraph justification, with spacing, with paragraph numbering, page headings, and so forth. So most people prefer to proofread on paper rather than on the screen. So here are some tips for how you can proofread better every time. First, if you're going to be drafting contracts, and if you're a transactional lawyer, you will be doing that, you should develop a template, a document template that works for you. And when you start a new document, you should always start with that template. If you get the template right, it will probably save you a lot of time and effort in fixing formatting problems. Another thing that I highly suggest is that you develop your own punch list to use when you proofread. In other words, before the document goes out the door from you, make sure you have checked all the things that you're likely to miss. And while everybody's punch list will be a bit different, I'm going to suggest one near the end of this presentation. Another suggestion is to avoid unnecessary formatting. You will see some contracts that have a lot of typography in them, and you need to develop the right balance. Just remember that every time you use special formatting for something like headings and so forth, you're going to have to proofread all of that. So you might want to take it easy on the special formatting. Another very important tip is that when you write contracts and you define the names of the parties, try to avoid paired names that look very similar, like lessor, lessee. And also, I try to avoid defined party names that start with the same letter. It's a lot harder to see the difference between something like lessor, lessee, and lessor and tenant, for example. In fact, when defining party names, I much prefer to use the actual names of the parties or a shortened version of their name, because to me that is much easier to proofread in the long run. That doesn't always work, of course. There are at least two situations in which you shouldn't do that. One is where you're writing a form agreement that you expect to be used with multiple parties. Then obviously you can't hard code the name of the party into the document. And the other is that when you're working on very sensitive documents, like for instance, public company M&A documents, it's common not to put the names of the parties in at all until the very end in order to avoid leaks of information. But subject to those things, I recommend using actual names of parties and party names that are easily recognizable. It will just make your life easier when you're proofreading. But your job is not done when the contract is done, when the document is done. When you send a contract out, you need to make sure and proofread everything about how you're sending the document. And for most of us these days, you're going to send things by email. So here are a few suggestions for meta items that you should look at. Check the ray line. It's very easy to miss that when you're proofreading. Check the spelling and the name of the email recipient. Check the name of the document file, because often when we create documents, we call the document by one name, and I mean literally the name of the document on your system, and it changes while we're working on the document, so be sure it's correct. When you look at your email string, make sure that you delete any artifacts that shouldn't be there. For example, crosstalk between you and your supervisor. Use the right version of the document. I have to say that the worst mistakes I've made in practice over the years have all been about using the wrong versions of documents. And a tip, particularly for beginners, when you send a redlined version showing changes between one version of a document and the other, you should always explain what that red line is, because it's not always obvious. Sending accurate red lines is considered a professional courtesy in the transactions practice, and it's very important to do this. Now, here are some suggestions about grammar. So, unfortunately, you may not have learned these things in your education, but these are some of the top grammatical mistakes that I see that are very common in documents written by lawyers. And one of the ways that you separate yourself from the rest of the herd is to get these things right instead of getting them wrong. And yes, you may be able to rely on grammar checkers to find some of these, but they don't always find all of them, so you need to know about them anyway. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can hit pause and look at these at your leisure. I'll just leave the slide on for a moment for you to take a look. Now here I'm straying outside of proofreading a little bit and talking about some common drafting mistakes. These are mistakes that I see very regularly. The first one is using the word within to describe a date range. In fact, the word within can mean before or after. And so in some cases, it will be obvious because there's only one possible interpretation. Sometimes there are both possible interpretations. And so I try never to use this word in legal drafting. When I want to express a time, I say something to the effect of no later than 30 days after this event occurs instead of within 30 days, because within can mean before or after. The next example, the project will be completed by a certain date. The problem with this and all use of the passive voice in contract drafting is that it may not make clear whose responsibility it is. When you're writing a contract, you are normally writing sentences that should be in the active voice and in the imperative. So, lessor shall do this, licensee shall do this, and if you use the passive voice, it may not be clear which party is responsible. Next, about verbs, there are different philosophies on how to use the imperative verb in contract drafting. But the most important thing is that you be consistent about it. So if you're going to use the word shall, which is a verb form that isn't really used much outside of contract drafting, you need to use it consistently, because if you use will in some places and shall in other places, that opens up the interpretation that that implies a different level of obligation, which is probably not what you meant. I'm not going to go through every one of these. You can take a look on your own, but I'm going to point out one thing, which is about expressing numbers in contracts. You may wonder where this convention came from, that you write the numbers out and then you put them in parentheses in numeric form. That was originally intended as a way to avoid fraud, and it came from days when contracts were written by hand. In those days, it was a lot easier to change numbers, and it was harder to change them if they were also written out. But of course, that doesn't make any sense anymore because contracts are always done by word processor today. The problem with this is that the written out numbers control. And the reason they control is because it was easier to doctor the numeric figures. But the written out numbers are harder to proofread than the numeric figures. So if you get this wrong, as it is on the slide, it says 1,000 and then in parenthesis 100. It's going to be the 1,000 that controls, and that's usually the opposite of the result you would want. On the next one, the problem is after delivery of what, the invoice or the products. And on the final one problem with referencing a year is that it's not clear whether it's a calendar year or a fiscal year of 12 months. So you have to be careful about both of those. For purposes of this presentation, the item about the numbers is the most important, and I will mention it again later on in the presentation. One of the things you can do to avoid typos in your contracts is to avoid drafting practices that introduce typo traps unnecessarily. And whether you need to do some of these things is contextual. But for example, in some contracts, it's probably not necessary to define the term party or third party or day or business day because even without the definition, they are reasonably clear. So when you're writing a contract, think carefully about whether you need to engage in legal formalism in a way that is going to make the contract harder to proofread. If, for example, you use the term parties as a defined term, capitalized, then you're going to have to make sure that every time you refer to the parties, it's capitalized. Otherwise, you're introducing ambiguity. And one of the biggest ways that typos creep into contracts is that people use a provision from another contract they've worked on, and they drop it into the one that they're working on now. And those two documents used slightly different conventions about items like this. So whenever you're doing that and putting together contracts in bits and pieces from different contracts you've worked on before, make sure that you're conforming everything when you drop it into the contract. I've got a few more examples of things that are probably not necessary and tend to make contracts harder to proofread, such as using the convention of writing out numbers and then using the parenthesis, making all of the defined terms all caps, putting trademark symbols on party names, which is not necessary, and putting punctuation at the end of every list. By the way, some of these things are not only typo traps, they're sort of old-fashioned, and they are not typical in contemporary contracts. So I invite you not to use these conventions. Okay, more about numbers. I invite you to consider which of these is easiest to read and therefore easiest to proofread. And I think you will probably agree with me that it's the second one. And this is consistent with what I would call AP style or journalistic style, which is that numbers below 10 or up to 10 are written out, and others are actually put in numerical form. But when you use a figure like 1 million, you write it out. You should always write something in the way that it's easiest to read, because numbers are some of the most important things you're putting in contracts. They're going to be pricing, they're going to be timing, and they are going to be the things that absolutely need to be right so that the people interpreting the contract will know what to do. In other words, numbers are often material terms of contracts. So here's kind of a fun exercise about proofreading. I saw this sign in the lobby of our building. It, by the way, was put up by our landlords. This is, I I was working at O'Melveny and Myers, and you'll see here that the sign says that two of the businesses are on the first floor and one of them is in Suite 100. Well, the problem, of course, is that Suite 100 is the first floor. So the question is, why are they different? What does Suite 100 mean that first floor doesn't mean? This is the kind of problem, the kind of mistake inconsistency that will be embarrassing to you as a lawyer. You need to make sure that when you are describing something, if you're describing several things that are the same in some respect, that you describe them in the same way. In fact, all of these businesses were all on the first floor and there were none anywhere else. So it was a very strange sign, which, by the way, was later fixed. And here's another little exercise that is as much about drafting as it is about proofreading, but it has an important lesson for proofreading. So if you see a provision like this, and if you try to get rid of all of the unnecessary words, I think you'll find there's very little left. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about this on your own, and then I'll show the next slide. As you can see, it got a lot shorter. And not only is this shorter, it's a lot easier to proofread. Here's the original again. So, moreover is never necessary in a contract. The parties hereto hereby agree is not necessary, since the entire contract is what the parties agree to. At all times is not a limiting phrase and not necessary. During the term of this agreement is generally not necessary, except if you want to actually alter the terms of this particular provision to be in effect after the term of the agreement. Without exception is not necessary. Words like strictly are not necessary, and unless otherwise expressly agreed in writing by the parties hereto is also not necessary, because you can always alter a contract by an agreement in writing. So you can greatly reduce the verbiage here and make it easier to read and easier to proofread. And the point here is that if you improve your drafting and make it more terse, you will improve your proofreading too. One of the common mistakes in proofreading is not reading the so-called boilerplate at the back of the contract. And these are some of my favorite mistakes from the miscellaneous provisions. A lot of notice provisions haven't been rewritten in decades and actually require fax notice. And that is probably the last way you want to get a notice. Severability, there are different ways to write them. I think the preferred way is reformation, and most severability provisions aren't actually written that way. You should always be careful about dates. If you've ever done due diligence on, say, an M&A deal, you'll see that in the real world, a lot of contracts don't get dated properly. And so if they have a date that isn't filled in, what happens? Is my preference, by the way, not to rely on the dates on the signature lines, because people who sign contracts often don't date them. I prefer to have a specific date to fill in at the beginning of the contract. And finally, force majeure. If you read those provisions and you think about how they apply post-COVID-19 pandemic, you might think that some of them don't make a lot of sense at this point. So the whole point here is you have to read every provision, and it doesn't matter whether it's so-called boilerplate, and you'll show your attention to detail if you read every provision and correct what needs to be corrected. So here's an example of a punch list that you might use before you send a contract out the door. And this is only just a partial list. You should really develop your own list, because The way that you proofread things can be specific to context. If you're in particular kinds of practices, it's going to be different from other kinds of practices. So develop your punch list, and every time you put the finishing touches on a contract, go through every item in the punch list. You'll be glad you did. So here's a quick summary. Create your own template for when you're drafting on your own. Develop consistent drafting habits. Use the tools available to you, but don't rely on automated tools to the exclusion of everything else. Get a nice ruler. I highly recommend that you get one you really like, because when you're doing things that can be challenging to do, having something that you like in front of you can make it a little bit easier. Use your punch list and check the meta items. Finally, if you want to read more about this topic, there are some really great resources here. There are many more as well. There's a great book called Typography for Lawyers. It's lots of fun to read. I highly recommend it. If you're interested in drafting practices and precision, I can't recommend anything more highly than Brian Garner's information and courses. And if you're interested in journalistic style, take a look at the Chicago Manual of Style. And of course, there is the old classic, The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. And that's it for this presentation. I hope you found it useful and maybe a little bit enjoyable. And I wish you luck on your journey learning to be a better proofreader. On this slide is one of my books about technology licensing, and it includes some information about drafting practices. This is Heather Meeker. Thanks for listening. I'm signing off.